These are the planes that won the Battle of Midway, that bombed the heart out of Hitler's Germany. The planes that fought the air war over the jungles of Indochina and the deserts of Iraq. These are the planes that define the meaning of air power. These are the legends of air combat. The B-29 Superfortress was designed and built by Boeing to meet a U.S. requirement for a long-range strategic bomber. What Boeing produced was a mighty warplane, able to operate at high altitude and to deliver a heavy bomb load over great distances. With the outbreak of the Second World War, the War Department became concerned that in the event of a Nazi victory, the U.S. might eventually find itself drawn into a conflict with Germany without the benefit of either European allies or bases. As first the Low Countries, then France, reeled and then buckled under the Nazi onslaught, and as the UK's air defenses were subjected to merciless attack by the Luftwaffe, the need for a long-range U.S. bomber became imperative.
What we remember today about Great Britain in the spring and summer of 1940 is that soaring Churchillian rhetoric of, we shall fight them in the beaches, we shall fight them on the landing fields, we shall never surrender. But the fact is, there was a considerable element of British political leadership that was very amenable to the notion of a negotiated peace with Germany, to in effect turn their back on Nazi hegemony in Europe as the price for preserving the empire and avoiding a financially ruinous and bloody remake of World War I.
In the event of war with Germany, lack of bases in the UK would require the delivery of sizable bomb loads across the Atlantic from Iceland or eastern Canada. The bomber would also have to operate without fighter escort. This demanded not only great range, but also heavy defensive armament. Additionally, it would require pressurized accommodation in order to operate at altitudes above the ceiling of enemy fighters and adverse weather. At this stage, there was no consideration of using the new bomber in the Pacific. Although military planners in the War Department considered a conflict with Japan highly likely, no one thought the Japanese could achieve the imperial expansion they managed after December 1941. The B-29 was conceived to fight a transatlantic air war, so it was paradoxical that when the B-29 became available for deployment, the air war with Germany was actually being adequately handled by the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator, operating from British bases. The size of Japan's new empire, however, demanded a heavy bomber with very long range, and it was for this Pacific task that the new B-29 was finally deployed.
It proved the Japanese that they were not as isolated as they thought they were going to be as far as World War II was concerned. And, but we knew that we had to carry the war to them with a bigger airplane and with greater capability.
Boeing had started engineering work on the development of the B-29 in mid-1938. Initially, the Army Air Force had been lukewarm to the proposed design. It was considered technologically risky and too expensive. By the summer of 1940, however, the need for a long-range bomber was undeniable. In August, the Army Air Force ordered 2 prototypes from Boeing. This was followed in September by a second order for a similar design from the Consolidated Aircraft Company. Designated the Consolidated B-32 Dominator, It was an insurance policy against the failure of the B-29 Superfortress. At the time, the Army Air Force's long-range and high-altitude bombers were the consolidated B-24 Liberator and Boeing's B-17 Flying Fortress. The combat radius of the definitive B-17G, with a typical bomb load of 5,070 pounds, was 1,200 miles. By comparison, the B-29 would have a combat radius of 1,750 miles, with a typical bomb load between 12,000 and 15,000 pounds. The first Superfortresses were 3 XB-29 prototypes, the first 2 of which were ordered in August 1940. These were built in Seattle, Washington. The XB-29s were followed by the 14 YB-29 service test aircraft. The test aircraft incorporated many improvements over the original prototype. They also had more powerful engines, driving 4 rather than 3-bladed propellers. The YB-29 machines were built in Wichita, Kansas, where full-scale production was to start. The B-29 was built in major sub-assemblies that were mated to complete the airplane. The fuselage comprised 2 main units in the form of the nose section, with its pressurized primary crew compartment inside the extensively glazed and hemispherical nose and the central section. This latter carried the wing, and under this were the 2 large weapons bays. These were covered by power-operated doors and were able to carry up to 20,000 pounds of bombs. The nose compartment was connected to the pressurized mid-fuselage crew compartment by a tunnel that passed through the weapons bay. Once structurally completed to a span of 141 feet 3 inches, the wing was lowered into its housing in the central fuselage, and the aperture was then closed to complete the forward part of the circular section fuselage. The Superfortress was powered by 4 Wright R-3350 air-cooled radial engines, which were 18-cylinder 2-row units rated at 2,200 horsepower and driving a 4-blade propeller. Each engine was fitted with 2 General Electric turbochargers for maximum power at higher altitudes. The engine nacelles were cleverly designed for low drag but maximum airflow for cooling. Below each engine was an air inlet for oil cooling and the intercooler for the paired turbochargers. The rear fuselage and tail unit were built as a single unit and incorporated the tail gunner's pressurized position with its 1 20mm cannon and 2 50-caliber machine guns. The addition of the tail section completed the 99-foot length of the B-29, which weighed 70,140 pounds when all the equipment had been added. The defensive armament comprised 2 50-caliber machine guns in each of 4 power-operated General Electric barbettes located as pairs above and below the fuselage. These barbettes were remotely controlled by gunners in adjacent siding blisters.
Being such an advanced airplane, and first first airplane with a computer system on it for the guns that would track the fighters coming at you, and they would lead the guns for the gunners. It was a computer sight, really. It was not a gun sight. The top CFC gunner had what was known as the barber chair, and he could spin that chair around and around just like a barber chair, and that's why we nicknamed it the barber chair.
The first XB-29 made its maiden flight on September 21st, 1942, in the hands of a Boeing crew led by Edward "Eddie" Allen. The second airplane first flew on the 28th of December in the same year, but was lost in February 1943 while trying to land with an engine on fire. The YB-29 service test airplanes flew on the 26th of June of the same year. Production of the B-29 service model was already well underway. However, even as the plane was still being tested, changes to the production model were so numerous and so frequent that finished planes would roll off the production lines and immediately be sent to depots for extensive modification. The turmoil caused by this so-called Battle of Kansas nearly ended the program. Only the intervention of General Hap Arnold saved the B-29. Eventually, after almost a year of ongoing modifications, Boeing was able to create effective production line warplanes out of what had been little-tested, handmade prototypes and service test machines. Japan drew the United States into World War II on December 7, 1941, with its carrier-borne air attack on the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. It also struck at U.S. air bases on Oahu in the Hawaiian Islands and almost simultaneously attacked the Philippines.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Japanese forces then surged out into the Pacific to the east, south, and southwest against U.S., British, and Dutch interests. America was now clearly embroiled in a major war, and this added enormous urgency to the Superfortress program. The B-29 offered the means to project air power across vast distances in the Pacific and eventually to strike at the Japanese home islands. In the spring of 1942, however, the B-29 prototypes were still being built. Even then, the most forward U.S. bases were still well out of range of the Japanese home islands. In an effort to restore civilian morale after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered the Army Air Force to launch an air raid on Japan. In mid-April 1942, the carrier USS Hornet was heading for Japan. Her flight deck was loaded with 16 North American B-25 Mitchell twin-engine bombers of the U.S. Army Air Force. The bombers had been lightened as much as possible and fitted with additional fuel tanks. On the 18th of April, some 800 miles from Japan, the bombers lumbered off the deck of the Hornet one by one. Led by Lieutenant Colonel James Jimmy Doolittle, the launch of the raid had been brought forward by a day because Japanese PK boats had detected the task force. The arrival of the Mitchells over Japan a day earlier than anticipated caught the Japanese by surprise. The bombers proceeded to attack Tokyo, Kobe, Yokohama, and Nagoya, but they caused little significant damage.
Psychologically, the Doolittle raid was a stunning success for the United States. Within months of the raid on Pearl Harbor, the United States had responded by striking at the heart of the Japanese Empire and bombing its capital, Tokyo. Public confidence soared, and the event was a huge boost to civilian morale. Militarily, however, the Doolittle raid was a disaster. All 16 of the planes were lost. 14 of the flight crews eventually made their way back to the United States. 2 of the flight crews were either captured or killed by the Japanese. What the Doolittle raid demonstrated was that, from a military standpoint, the United States simply did not have the ability for projecting air power over Japan, even with the deployment of the B-29. It would take 2.5 years of hard fighting before the United States was in a position to project air power over Japan in a meaningful way.
At this time, the B-29 production program was accelerating rapidly. Initially, 2 Boeing plants were involved. These were at Wichita, Kansas, and at Renton, Washington. The program was then boosted as 2 other manufacturers brought their weight to bear. These were Bell at Marietta, Georgia, and Martin at Omaha, Nebraska. These 4 production lines were fed by a huge subcontracting effort for components and subassemblies at plants large and small all over the United States. The 58th Very Heavy Bombardment Wing was activated on June 1, 1943, in anticipation of the delivery of B-29 aircraft. That year, it was decided that the Superfortress, because of its range and payload, would be operated only in the Pacific Theater. The first of 2,513 B-29 production aircraft was delivered only 2 months after the first B-29. 1,119 B-29As were built at Renton. 311 B-29Bs were made only at Marietta. The balance were built in a variety of other plants scattered around the U.S. The first major operational deployment of the B-29 was in western China. Japanese forces controlled most of the eastern part of China, but the planned U.S. bases around Chengdu in the west of the country would bring major Japanese targets in eastern China and Southeast Asia within range, as well as some of the most strategically important ones in Japan's home islands. The first superforts assigned to Chinese bases were those of the 58th Wing, and in the spring of 1944, they deployed from the United States. Their route took them across the Atlantic to North Africa, and from there, via Cairo, to eastern India. The Wing's 40th, 444th, 462nd, and 468th Bombardment Groups then undertook initial training. Their first operational mission was against the railroad maintenance facilities in Bangkok. But the main operating bases were to be in China. This meant flying the B-29s over the Hump, the jagged peaks of the eastern Himalayas. Meanwhile, near Chengdu, in western China, 4 massive air bases were under construction at Guanghan, Xinjing, Gonglai, and Pongshan. In war-ravaged China, there was no spare machinery available, but there was still plenty of Chinese manpower. The basing of the B-29s in China was only an interim measure, but similar to the shuttle bombing missions in Europe, where B-17s operated from Russian bases. It helped to encourage America's battle-weary allies. Over 75,000 Chinese workers, under the direction of 26 American officers and enlisted men, labored to prepare the runways and hard standings for the heavy B-29s. Everything had to be done by hand. Stones were broken down using hammers. Mud and gravel was mixed to provide a basic form of concrete. Teams of 150 men hauled 10-ton rollers to compress the runways, and all at the cost of $150 million. On April 24, 1944, the first B-29s of the newly created 20th Bomber Command, under the direct command of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, began to arrive. The 20th was commanded by Major General Kenneth B. Wolfe. Nearly all the immense airfields were ready. They had been built in only 3 months. The superfortresses had crossed the Atlantic, Africa, and India. They had flown from Kansas to China in a week. But what was probably the most incredible feat of all was that it happened only a year and a half after the first experimental B-29 had been flown. Because of the lack of infrastructure at the Chinese bases, virtually everything, including food, spares, ground equipment, and above all, ammunition, bombs, and fuel, had to be flown in over the hump from India to China. Fuel arrived by air at the bases in 50-gallon drums. These were then rolled by Chinese troops to the storage area. The fuel was then poured into a long trough and the gas pumped to one of the large storage tanks. It took up to 2 hours to refuel a B-29 with over 6,800 gallons of gasoline. Despite prodigious efforts, the shortage of fuel and lack of infrastructure would be a constant problem for the new bomber force. After settling into the bases and preparing his aircraft and fuel stocks, on the 14th of June, General Wolfe briefed Colonel Harmon. Harmon was to be the group commander for the mission against the Imperial Iron and Steel Works in Yawata, on Japan's home island of Kyushu. 63 B-29s reached the target, but 7 aircraft were lost in this first raid against Japan proper. From their Chinese bases, the growing B-29 force struck at Japanese targets in Eastern Asia, including base and manufacturing areas on the island of Formosa off the eastern coast of China. But despite their successes, the Superfortress were still out of range of many major targets in Japan itself. Other targets, however, were found in Siam, which was an ally of Japan and allowed the use of its airfields, ports, and transport system by the Japanese. The Japanese had held most of the Mariana Islands since 1914 and had invaded the U.S. possession of Guam in 1940. The Marianas lie only a short distance, in strategic terms, from the Japanese home islands, and much effort had been spent in building up their defenses. The strategic position of the Marianas was the linchpin of U.S. strategy in the Central Pacific. They lay within bombing range of the southern part of the Japanese home islands, where most of Japan's war industries were located. They were critical to bring the war to Japan proper. The Japanese also appreciated the strategic importance of the islands and the consequence of an American victory. The Marianas witnessed the first large-scale example of the determination of the Japanese military to defend a doomed position to the last man. This led to some of the bloodiest fighting of the war, as 40,000 Japanese soldiers were killed in a vain attempt at stemming the U.S. advance. Over 4,500 Americans died during the taking of the Marianas. Moreover, such was the fear of U.S. occupation that large numbers of Japanese civilians on the islands chose to commit suicide rather than fall into American hands. With the Marianas in U.S. hands, the Army Air Forces now had new bases from which another B-29 force, the 21st Bomber Command, partnering the 20th Bomber Command in Western China, could strike at Eastern China and at the Japanese home islands. There were existing Japanese airfields, but as soon as the islands were secure, a huge effort began to create a complex of 5 great bases. These would eventually host the 21st Bomber Command's 5 180-plane bombardment wings, which could operate directly against Japan with lighter fuel loads and thus with heavier bomb loads. The advantage of bases in the Marianas was also that logistical support for the bombers by sea would be a relatively straightforward matter.
At Bowling Field, Washington, D.C., General Henry Arnold, Air Force's commander, greets the pilot and crew of the first Superfort bound for Saipan. The flyers take with them a message from General Arnold. To the warlords of Japan, we have not forgotten. the B-29s will remind you again and again and again. The first B-29s arrive at Saipan, 7,000 miles from their starting point in the USA. Every man on Saipan has worked toward this day. Now they welcome the big bombers. General Haywood Hansel, leader of the 21st Bomber Command.
General Hansel's mission was now to strike at the Japanese home islands. Tokyo lies some 1,500 miles from Saipan, from which the first raid of 111 aircraft was launched on the Japanese capital on November 24, 1944.
Our target for today is one of three of the Nakajima aircraft plants located 11 miles west of Tokyo.
Our wing was the first to hit Tokyo after the Doolittle raid of 1942 with B-25s. The 498th Bomb Group, 874th Squadron, we were part of the 73rd Bomb Wing. General Rosie O'Donnell was our wing commander out of Saipan, flying from Saipan over Japan. So our wing was the first one to bomb Tokyo, which was target 357, the Mitsubishi Nakajima Musashino plant outside Tokyo, 357, and was highly defended, ack-ack fighters, and it was a fearsome target, to say the least.
As always, the mission began with an exhaustive briefing for the flight crews, covering factors such as the target, alternate target, force strength, and likely ground-based and air opposition. The immense flying distances created their own problems, particularly with changing weather conditions. Meanwhile, ground crews completed preparations on the aircraft, ensuring that every item was serviceable. Armorers loaded the airplanes with the required bomb loads and ensured that the defensive guns have their full ammunition loads available. All around the vast airfield, there was frantic activity. The 10-man flight crews arrived on the flight line and checked with their ground crews to ensure that all was ready. Last-minute discussions are held. Two of the crew of the lead ship, Dauntless Dottie, were already famous. The pilot, Robert Morgan, and the bombardier, Vince Evans, had flown with the legendary B-17 Memphis Belle on 25 missions over Germany. Hearts started to pump and minds to race as the flight checks were completed and the engine started. The Superfortresses then taxi out in sequence toward the runway and form up in anticipation of the order to start the mission. Takeoff is always a dangerous part of the whole operation, as each airplane is laden with bombs and full of flammable fuel. Once the bombers have taken off and formed up, they cruise toward the target area, their altitude increasing gradually as fuel is consumed. This is the opportunity for last-minute checks on navigation, communications, and weapons. But otherwise, the long cruise is tedious.
Between Saipan and Japan, there was always numerous fronts rolling in and out of Manchuria and across Japan and on down in the Pacific. So we had a lot of weather we had to climb through. In the early days, we were flying formation all the way from Saipan, and we would climb in formation through the weather. That was pretty harrowing.
Finally, Mount Fuji comes into sight, and the crews know that they are within striking distance of an enemy, prepared to fight for his home by any and all means. The sudden appearance of small black clouds marks the bursts of anti-aircraft shells.
We dreaded the attack, and it just wasn't much you could do about that. You just had to go through it and hope it didn't hit you. I, for one, would not go over the target pressurized, because if you got a hit from the ack or a fighter, you're going to depressurize immediately. You're going to have a lot of confusion of the crew members getting on oxygen and getting things under control. So I purposely went over the target unpressurized.
Finally, the target is below them, the huge Nakajima aircraft plant in the suburbs of Tokyo. And the bombs rain down. The aircraft initially attack from high altitude and generally release large numbers of medium-capacity, high-explosive bombs. Sighting is comparatively straightforward, even though high-altitude flight often means the presence of cloud. But the crews all too soon become aware that accurate high-altitude bombing is difficult because of the almost universal presence over Japan of strong but variable winds.
Our initial point was somewhere around Mount Fujiyama, and we'd turn easterly and start the bomb run. And of course, our jet stream would push us right over the target and added to our speed of our B-29 by anywhere from 125 to even 250 knots. And that was completely unexpected. And of course, the bombardier couldn't stop the rate over the target, and the northern bomb sights couldn't kill the drift. We'd slide over the target. For a while, we really scattered a lot of bombs all over Japan, so to speak.
After a mission lasting more than 13 hours, the bombers return and land back on Saipan in the dark. The crews are exhausted, with slightly damaged aircraft and wounded crew members on board, but are mightily relieved to have returned safely.
As the commanding general of the Army Air Forces put it,
no part of the Japanese Empire is now out of our range. No war factory too remote to feel our bombs. The battle for Japan is now underway with full speed ahead.
The Japanese responded rapidly to the attack on Tokyo with a desperate air raid on Saipan. The raid involved 15 land-based aircraft from Japan. All but one of the attacking aircraft were knocked down by the U.S. defenses. The attack caused a number of spectacular fires, but inflicted only limited American casualties and destroyed only a few aircraft. The attack revealed the fear, now evident in Tokyo, about the threat from the B-29s in the Marianas. After the raid, the wrecked and damaged aircraft were rapidly cleared from the airfields. But the Americans quickly made good their losses and improved radar, anti-aircraft defenses, and fighter cover made any repeat attack impossible. Operations were hardly impeded, and the tonnage of bombs dropped on Japan steadily increased. In August 1944, Major General Curtis E. LeMay assumed command of the 20th Bomber Command in China, and later took command of the 21st Bomber Command in the Marianas. Between January and April 1945, the 20th Bomber Command moved from China to the Marianas, giving LeMay an extraordinarily powerful combined bomber force. LeMay, however, soon realized that high-altitude daylight bombing was ineffective, and on March 9, 1945, ordered low-altitude night bombing with a far higher proportion of incendiaries. The results were devastating and showed the true potential of the Superfortress.
Had there not been a B-29, then the air war over Japan would have been fought primarily by B-17s and B-24s and other mid-range bombers. That air war would not have started in any substantive way until the spring and summer of 1945. It would have gone longer. The amount of tonnage dropped on Japan would have been substantially less. and the entire length of the war might easily have been increased. Would it have been increased by a period of years? No, not really. Would it have been increased by a period of months? Absolutely. Given the course of events in the spring and summer of 1945 in East Asia and Japan, the continuation of the war by another 3 to 6 months could have resulted in a very different political configuration in East Asia and in Japan.
The increasing tempo and heavier weight of bombs and incendiaries crippled Japan's ability to maintain an effective war-making effort. Civilian workers were killed or displaced, factories were destroyed, and communications were increasingly disrupted. In February and March, the United States assaulted the small volcanic island of Iwo Jima in what was to become a horrifically bloody campaign. The island was a further stepping stone closer to the Japanese home islands and was of great strategic importance. It would provide the Army Air Forces with the makings of 3 airfields closer to Japan itself than those on the Marianas. These airfields would provide the crews of B-29s, either damaged or low on gas, with somewhere to land.
And of course, if you're shot up, wounded crew members on board, which some did have, and I was very fortunate. I only had one wounded crew member at one point over Japan, and we had Iwo Jima by that time, so I had to take him into the hospital there. They saved his life.
They would also open the way for the basing of P-51 Mustang single-engine escort fighters within operational range of Japan. From Iwo Jima, the Mustangs, many of them flown by veterans of the war in Europe, could range right over the Japanese home islands. Altogether superior to anything the Japanese could field in useful numbers, the P-51s could, for the first time, provide the Superfortresses with fighter escort during their missions over Japan. LeMay's switch from high to low altitude bombing was also accompanied by a change in typical bomb loads. A far higher proportion of incendiaries were now carried to burn out Japan's cities and industrial areas. Smaller weights of HE bombs were still carried, as these were more effective in destroying railroads, bridges, and the all-important concrete floors of Japan's war-making industries. The first fire raid on Tokyo, using 174 low-flying B-29s to drop incendiaries, took place on the night of February 24th through the 25th, 1945. It was followed with a second attack on the night of March 9th through 10th, when 279 Superforts dropped some 1,700 tons of bombs on the capital. About 16 square miles of the city were destroyed.
Very few fighters were encountered because it caught them completely by surprise, because General LeMay brought us down from higher level bombing altitudes that we'd been using up to that time to, I think our bombing altitude that night over the target was around 7,500 feet.
The firebombing campaign proved totally devastating. It has been estimated that some 100,000 people died in the resulting firestorm. And of Japan's major cities, only the cultural center of Kyoto escaped relatively unscathed. The port city of Kuli and its naval base received particular attention. The bombers also flew mine-laying raids over Japanese ports and coastal waters. These led to the losses of many of Japan's dwindling warships, and also devastated the coastal shipping, which played so important a role in Japan's logistical system.
We were shot up quite a bit. Our guns were shot out of electrically. Some way the flak was so bad that day over Curie Harbor. We sunk the Japanese cruiser Haruna that had been in on the attack on the Philippines. We were carrying 500-pound bombs, and somebody's hit that baby and it sank right there. We sank it right in Curie Harbor.
Devastating as the firebombing of Tokyo was, the U.S. was now developing a new, still more destructive weapon. This was the atom bomb, a primitive yet devastating fission-type weapon resulting from a huge Allied effort centered in America's research and industrial facilities. On July 16, 1945, this pioneering device was detonated during the Trinity tests near Alamogordo, New Mexico. Its yield was estimated at about 20 kilotons.
We're standing in front of the first atomic bomber, the Enola Gay, a storied B-29 which carried the revolutionary atomic bomb to the enemy. Gathered here are a group of key men representing both the project personnel in the theater and the Air Corps. It was this group and this airplane which outvoted present warfare. This is Colonel Paul Tibbets of Miami, Florida, commander of the Atomic Bomb Group. Colonel Tibbets, will you tell us some of your reactions over the target?
Well, as the bomb left the airplane, we took over manual control, made an extremely steep turn to try and put as much distance between ourselves and the explosion as possible. After we felt the explosion hit the airplane, that is the concussion waves, we knew that the bomb had exploded, everything was a success, so we turned around to take a look at it. The sight that greeted our eyes was quite beyond what we had expected, because we saw this cloud of boiling dust and debris below us with this tremendous mushroom on top. Beneath that was hidden the ruins of the city of Hiroshima.
Major Tom Fairby of Marksville, North Carolina, bombardier of the first atomic bomber.
My navigator had me perfectly lined up with the target. When I clutched in with my sight, I could clearly see the city of Hiroshima within my bomb sight. Then I clutched in and took the run, and I felt the bump of the airplane. I was greatly relieved because I knew the unit had gone from the airplane.
Hiroshima received its atomic bomb on August 6, 1945, and 3 days later, Nagasaki was bombed by another superfort, the Boxcar, flown by a crew whose usual B-29 was called the Great Artiste.
This is Major Charles W. Sweeney of Quincy, Massachusetts, pilot of the Great Artiste, the second B-29 to drop an atomic bomb on the Empire.
We were briefed on, of course, a primary and a secondary target as usual. We took off and the flight was uneventful except for some weather on the way up. The primary target was located, and we made 3 runs on it, but were unable to get into it. Commander Ashworth and I held a little conference with the bombardier and the navigator, and we started for the secondary target, which was Nagasaki, at which time the flight engineer told us we had just 1,300 gallons of gasoline left. We picked our route into the secondary target and dropped it on Nagasaki. We were very relieved to have it go. Much more relieved when we saw the tremendous flash and knew that it had functioned. At that point, we hit the road for Okinawa, the first petrol station.
After the attack on Hiroshima and the surrender of Japan, U.S. Army camera crews recorded the utter devastation to the center of the city.
The devastation you see here was caused by the explosion of the bomb above this 0 point. Only the strongest buildings are left standing, and they are gutted. Looking north from 0 point, this is what was left. Looking east, the camera records a scene of complete devastation in the immediate area. To the south, these are the ruins. Looking west from 0 point, the same complete leveling is evident, the same inability of structures to withstand atomic power. This barren area, 3/10 of a mile from 0 point, once contained the main Japanese military headquarters. The barracks were utterly destroyed. Most of the military personnel of approximately 20,000 were wiped out.
Even after the 2 A-bomb attacks, the Superfortress raids on Japan continued as the bomber crew sought to destroy every last vestige of Japan's war-making capability. But most knew the end was in sight. Psychologically devastated by the two atomic bomb attacks, the Japanese agreed to an unconditional surrender in August and formally surrendered to the Allies on September 2, 1945, in a ceremony on board the U.S. battleship Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. World War II was over. The relatively undamaged Imperial Palace in Tokyo was still visited by the Japanese, who came to pay their respects to the emperor. But now, U.S. aircraft could fly unhindered over Japan.
One of 3 B-29 bombers arrived at Chicago Airport after a 6,000-mile non-stop flight from Japan in 25 hours. Generals O'Donnell, LeMay, and Giles, commanders of Superfortress warfare against Japan, piloted these ships home. Stripped of armor and guns, the planes originally carried 10,000 gallons of gasoline at the takeoff from Hokkaido Island for the trip via the Arctic Circle, a quarter way around the world. Now the B-29 group comes down at Washington after 29 hours, and the B-29 officers are greeted by Air Force's Chief Arnold. 3 men who have earned a well done for their successful leadership.
After the war, the B-29 also became a multiple record breaker. One B-29B, named Pakusan Dreamboat, with modified engine nacelles, fuel-injected engines, and special propellers, established a world non-stop distance record on November 12, 1945. The airplane was in effect a flying fuel tank, and lifting off from Guam and landing outside Washington, D.C., covered 7,916 miles for a new straight-line distance record. After the war, the United States, which at the time had a monopoly of atomic weapons, decided to further develop and test an improved A-bomb. The site selected was Bikini Atoll in the remote Bikini Islands group, 5,000 miles from the U.S. Bikini Atoll was therefore prepared as the site for the detonations of America's 4th and 5th nuclear devices. A number of obsolete U.S. warships, as well as surrendered German and Japanese vessels, were assembled in the waters off Bikini. Because the tests were designated to aid the development of future U.S. warships and equipment, different vehicles and weapons were strapped to the decks of the target ships in order to assess their vulnerability to nuclear attack.
4 such radio-directed planes will fly over Bikini Atoll in connection with America's atomic bomb experiments against obsolete and enemy naval vessels.
A major observer of the tests was General LeMay, now Deputy Chief of Staff of Research. The Superfort, destined to drop the new test bomb, was Dave's dream, and she took off on the mission from Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands.
On the deck of the famous Shangri-La, flagship for the experiment, pilotless planes rehearse their part in operation. Guided by radio, 4 of them will fly through the billowing masses of smoke following the atomic blast. Each will carry airtight bags that will scoop up samples of the smoke.
There were to be 2 tests in July 1946. The first bomb would be dropped by the B-29 over the target ships. personnel from a nearby Navy observation task force would observe the detonation. The aiming point for the 21-kiloton device was the obsolete battleship USS Nevada. Later, a second device of similar yield was exploded underwater. In December 1945, the B-29D had been redesignated as the B-50. This was a much improved warplane built of a new alloy. The B-50 was powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney R-4360 radial engines, each rated at 3,500 horsepower. The B-50 bore the brunt of the new U.S. Air Force's heavy bombing operations during the Korean War in the early 1950s. As always, their attacks were devastating. North Korea possessed little in the way of industrial capability, so the B-50s were used primarily in attacks on railroads, bridges, tunnels, ports, military dumps, and troop concentrations. The B-50 carried the same offensive and defensive armament as the B-29, but its more powerful engines led to a maximum speed of 385 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The B-29 was some 20 miles per hour slower at the same altitude. The more powerful engines also meant a reduction in range because they burned more fuel. Some 371 such aircraft were built for service up to 1965, the B-29 having been retired earlier in the decade. In 1949, a B-50A named the Lucky Lady II, flown by a 13-man crew under the command of Captain James G. Gallagher, became the first airplane to circle the world non-stop. This was achieved by aerial refueling. The flight, which lasted 96 hours and 1 minute, was from and back to Carswell Air Force Base, Texas. In March 1947, the U.S. Navy took over 4 B-29 aircraft for long-range search missions with the revised designation P2B-1S. One of these was later modified as the mother plane for the Douglas D-558-2 rocket-powered supersonic aircraft. The U.S. Air Force also used an example of the B-50, upgraded version of the B-29, as the mother plane for the Bell X-2, another rocket-powered supersonic machine. The X-2 was released from the modified bomb bay, and before being destroyed on its 10th flight on September 27, 1957, climbed to 126,200 feet and reached a speed of Mach 3.2. The Pacific War against Japan might have been different if the United States had not been able to deploy the B-29 to the theater. In that case, the Army Air Force would have been compelled to rely on the B-24, based initially in bases in western China. From there, the bombers could have attacked Japanese targets in eastern China, Formosa, Thailand, and French Indochina. But the U.S. would not have been able to bring the Japanese homeland under direct bombing attack until the capture of Iwo Jima and then Okinawa, which lie within the B-24 range of the home islands. With more of its industrial capacity intact, Japanese forces might have slowed down the advance of the Americans and lengthened the war by a year or more. The atomic bombing of Japan might also have been different. The B-29 was the only plane capable of carrying the A-bomb that had been built in Alamogordo. Forced to rely on another plane to deliver it, scientists might have been forced to design a smaller, less powerful bomb. Although still devastating, what impact a smaller, less powerful bomb might have had is unknown. A longer war would have opened the way to a broader Soviet involvement in the war against Japan, possibly resulted in a Soviet role in the Allied occupation of Japan, and almost certainly resulted in the Soviet occupation of the whole of the Korean Peninsula. If Japan had suffered a similar division, such as that of Germany, the future of the region would have been radically different. And there would probably have been no Korean War, no prosperous democratic South Korea, and the whole of the Korean Peninsula might have ended up under the control of the communist government of the North. The B-29's position in world and aviation history is secure. The airplane was a major technical achievement and was developed and brought into operational service in an extremely short time. It was instrumental in the defeat of Japan during 1944 and 1945, and will always be remembered as the world's first nuclear-armed strategic bomber. The B-29 Superfortress is truly one of the legends of air combat.